us, but we're not really here. We're taking a week off, aren't we, Michael?
We are. We've had a long summer, a lot of shows. Hope you've been watching and listening.
Yeah, well, we've had a long couple of years on this Zoom thing. And
Not too long, but
frankly, I've had a lot of people in my house thanks to this radio program, and I need to clean it. Okay. And it's Labor Day week. Everybody else is like going to the lake or getting their school books or whatever. We need a fresh start. And so our buddy Luis down in Veracruz is helping us put together a compilation show.
Compilation show are we doing this week? Okay, that's good, Kate. I'm up for it. Who are we compiling?
Well, we're going to let Luis have the final cut, but I bet we're going to see some Beto O'Rourke, maybe a little Josina Morita.
And Jesus Chuy Garcia, our congressman, or a congressman from Chicago.
Posiblemente. We could have some surprises too. And we'll throw some Labor Day appropriate music or, inappropriate, whatever. It's the end of summer, everybody. Get in the lake one more time. This is the perfect week.
Yeah, but listen to this show before you go jumping in the lake. And, we are on the radio. We are streamed. And then, of course, you always can get it on youtube.com/Heartland Media, as well as now on podcasts on Google and Spotify.
That's a lot of directions, Michael. Everybody take a breath and just listen to the show now. And Michael is going to send it to you on email anyway. He will. He'll post it on Facebook like a half a dozen times. And I guess what we really want to say is thanks for being out there, y'all. All you listeners of Live from the Heartland for all these 20 plus years. We're still here. We'll be back next week with some brand new segments. And welcome back to the show, Josina Morita. So long since we've seen you. Josina is Metropolitan Water Reclamation District Commissioner, an urban planner, a community organizer, also now a mom and friend of the show. Josina, welcome back.
Thanks for having me. It's good to see you guys, even via Zoom.
I know. Likewise.
Josina, we've had a mass murder in Atlanta, an increase in hate crimes against Asian Americans. How is the Asian American community viewing all of this, and what's been the reaction?
It was such an awful thing that happened in Atlanta. The murders themselves, of course, are awful. But I think we've also seen the response from the deputy sheriff in Atlanta kind of denying that it was a hate crime. We've seen the media humanize the shooter more than they've humanized the victims. And so it's been an added kind of insult to injury, that we've seen, but it's not something that has necessarily been new to the Asian American community. I think that maybe one of the things that has come out of this has been a reckoning both within the Asian American community about who we are, and a lot of the silence that we've, had in our community about the racism that we experience. I've seen literally thousands of people start to tell their stories on Facebook of, being harassed, being ching-chonged, being asked persistently, where are you from? Underhanded compliments about being, sexualized as Asian American women. So I think it's been a real conversation about racism and misogyny within the community. And I think it's been a reckoning externally for a lot of Americans for the first time, really seeing what anti-Asian racism looks like. I think that there has been this perception that anti-Asian racism is somehow less violent, less urgent than other forms of racism. And I think that this has been a real awakening for a good portion of the country to see these murders and to really step up and say, okay, I see anti-Asian racism. I see Asian Americans beyond the model minority myth, my friendly neighbor who smiles and doesn't, kind of grits their teeth through the sideways comments. And so I am hopeful that as awful as the situation has been, that there is a lot of transformation and growth and good that can come out of this situation, both within the Asian American community, but also externally.
Josina Morita, can you share with us who makes up the Asian American community, and where do people come from, and what's the history, is what I'm asking, of immigration to the U.S. when people came from the Philippines, et cetera, to Hawaii, California? And there is a thing called the exclusion era, which I didn't know about. Maybe tell us about that.
Sure. I mean, I am 6th generation Chinese, 5th generation Japanese American. My family has been in this country since the 1850s. And so we have seen throughout the history of this country waves of anti-Asian hate, waves of scapegoating of Asian Americans and Asian immigrants, and waves of really racialized policy in this country. So, the Chinese Exclusion Act was targeted specifically to stop Chinese immigration, even though we were recruited here really to come to work as laborers, to build the Transcontinental Railroad, to work in coal mines. As a Japanese American, my family, my grandmother, who's still alive, was in internment camps and scapegoated during World War II. Held in 120,000 Japanese Americans held in internment camps by the US government for years with no charges and no convictions ever. The things that they were accused of. Filipino farm workers were the founders of the United Farm Workers in California. There's so much diversity in the Asian American community. We come from, dozens of countries, speak even more languages. We have different histories as to how and why we came to this country. A lot of it having to do with war, right? So fleeing wars, whether it be, the Vietnam War, the Cambodian, genocide, things like that have pushed Asian immigration in different ways, along with, of course, just economic hardship in home countries and kind of pull factors to the idea of the American dream here in this country. And so here in Illinois, we are the fastest growing population in the state, percentage-wise. We, for the history of Illinois until just, 10 years ago, really didn't have Asian Americans in elected office. I chair the Asian American Caucus. For years, we had an Asian American caucus with no Asians in it. We elected our first Asian American countywide, which was me, and our first Asian American in the General Assembly, Teresa Ma, in 2016. And I now chair a caucus of 9. And it's amazing, especially in this moment where we're talking about anti-Asian hate and, anti-Asian racism. Just 5 years ago, all 9 members of my caucus were not elected. So our progress is really palpable in this moment. I'm really proud of our caucus members to have, stood up to run, to win, and now really being voices in this really important moment for our community.
Josina, you mentioned the United Farm Workers being co-founders of the United Farm Workers, Filipino farm workers being part of United Farm Workers. And I wondered if you could expound upon that a little bit and talk about the intersection of the struggle for Asian rights in America with other civil rights movements, be they Black, Latino, women, et cetera.
Absolutely. Both of my parents were part of the Filipino farm worker organizations. My mom worked at Agbayani Village, which was a health clinic that was built for Filipino farm workers. She worked with Philip Veracruz and a lot of the Filipino farm worker leaders in Delano, California, who helped build the United Farm Workers, right, which is most famously known for Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. But Filipinos were a really big part of building that organization. And it's also a way, I think, that we look throughout history. There's a long history of Asian Americans in the labor movement. My cousin, Kent Wong, was the founder of Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance. We have a Paula chapter now here, help the Secretary Treasurer of the Chicago Federation of Labor is Filipino, Don Villar. here. And so there's been a long history of class solidarity, but also racial solidarity between Asian Americans and other communities. So that's an example of Filipinos and largely Mexican immigrant populations. And I think it's been a powerful moment for us right now to, as Asian Americans, for the first time, for a lot of people, seeing African American, Latino, white populations, communities standing with us in this moment. And I think it's a really important moment for our community to then recognize what our responsibility is to stand with other communities. For me, as an Asian American who's married to an African American, right, I can believe in supporting Asian women and supporting Black lives at the same time. And I think these connections are essential. We have a long history, particularly of Asian American and Black solidarity. Two of my heroes, Yuri Kochiyama, was part of the Harlem family, movement in New York with Malcolm X. If you've seen, of course, the awful picture of Malcolm X, when he was assassinated, she's the one holding him. There is an Asian American woman, Yuri Kochiyama, and she made those connections as somebody who grew up in the internment camps as a young child. To the struggles of Black communities in New York, and Grace Lee Boggs, who was a leader with particularly Black union workers, Black auto workers in Detroit. Right. So there's a long history there, and we hope to continue it.
Wow, that is, thank you so much for sharing what you just did, Josina. Josina Morita, what a pleasure, what an honor to have you with us today. Everything you've shared with us is so important. We're so lucky you're there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. It's great to see you guys.
Welcome back, Congressman. You have seen so much since being sworn in January 2019. We're not sure where to start, but since we have a short time with you, how was being in Congress with the previous resident throughout that campaign and on January 6th? Let's start there.
It's great to join you, Katie and Michael, today to talk about what's going on in Congress. Got to tell you, it's been a little bit over 2.5 years, but it feels like a dozen years. I feel like a veteran. I feel seasoned. I feel scarred in a good way. A lot of resiliency. We started off with a government shutdown on my first day as a member of Congress. And of course, we had 2 impeachment hearings. I supported, of course, both of them early on. And of course, we had the January 6th insurrection and the threat to democracy from right-wing elements and white supremacy in America. The good news is that Democrats have held fairly steady. We're progressing toward enacting what will be some of the most important landmark legislation that can be transformational, that can really usher in an era, a century of equity and progress, and really invest in children, in families, in young people, in immigrants, and yes, begin to address climate change and all of the disastrous consequences of that. Bring in finally immigration reform after a 35-year drought. So many exciting things happening in Congress. Of course, the expansion of Medicare, just to name a quick list of things that we probably will get into this morning. Great to be back with you.
Well, Congressman Garcia, aka Chuy, let's talk a moment about the For the People Act. This legislation would expand our freedom to vote, ensure that people's voices are heard, and safeguard our democracy. You've been quoted as saying it can be done, that the filibuster can be abolished. Expand on this and tell us how it's going.
Look, the For the People Act, also known as HR 1 and S1 in the Senate, is a bill whose time has come. It seeks to ensure that we get big money and dirty money and dark money out of politics. It would help remove the tremendous burden of corruption in the U.S. Congress, especially from big money and the wealthy and right-wing investors who have controlled the agenda, who have controlled politics all over the country, even at the local level because of big money in politics. It also would provide the renewal of the Voting Rights Act. I supported it in its entirety. Nevertheless, because of the challenges in the Senate, because we passed it out of the House in the previous Congress, in the 116th and in the 117th, we're having to prioritize certain aspects of that package because of the urgency. Voter suppression by Republicans and state legislatures in so many states to obviously keep people of color from voting, other people, low-income people, senior citizens, etc., by creating strict requirements for that. It is unabashedly an effort to suppress democracy and people's rights to vote. It's a throwback to the Jim Crow era in many ways. The good news is that we passed a part of what's in the For the People Act, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, before we left the House of Representatives on Tuesday, and it is a step forward. So I favor getting rid of the filibuster in the Senate. That has been my position for a long, long time. It is a relic of Jim Crow, and we need to do away with it. Protecting voting rights, however, is a key priority. We'll have to come back to whether we can get rid of the filibuster or not in the Senate, but I favor it because it's the right thing to do. And it would really help us clean up politics from Washington, D.C. down to the local level in cities like Chicago and suburban communities as well.
Chuy, what you call reconciliation work, which is what you guys are working on right now. Can you break that down for people and tell them what it is and what it involves right now legislatively?
So reconciliation, because that's a tough word to understand in the legislative context, is simply a method for addressing budgetary issues in Congress. It is used primarily in the Senate to address important budgetary issues. In this context and in this regard, currently, it is the only way for a simple majority in the Senate to be able to move legislation forward because of the ridiculous filibuster rule in the Senate that allows minority rule to prevail, where a minority of senators, and I'm not talking about 49 or 48, I'm talking about much fewer than them, to control the agenda on what goes forward and what dies in the Senate. It is a ridiculous rule. It is one that Southern Democrats and segregationists, for the most part, have championed over a long time to prevent civil rights legislation from occurring in the Senate. That's why it needs to go. The reconciliation process is one that says that if there are issues related to the budget, they can be passed with a simple majority. 51 votes, including the vote of the vice president in the current context. And that's why we're striving for a reconciliation budget package that would enable us to address everything from climate change, advance parts of the Green New Deal in that, rebuild our infrastructure, expand Medicare eligibility, lowering the age to 60, and including things like eye care, hearing aids, and dental coverage for seniors, because people on Medicare are not eligible for those things. And of course, providing important things like child care so that children can be safe, children can have a healthy place to develop, while their parents, especially so many working women who were the most affected during the pandemic, can return to work safely.
So you answer a lot of things with one answer.
Yeah, you took away all the questions. Now, let me ask you, how's your relationship with the moderate Democrats who very often give cash in big amounts to big pharma? You've said we're facing an uphill battle. You hope to allow Medicare to negotiate lower prices for prescription drugs, et cetera, et cetera. Give us your hit on big pharma and the Democrats who enable them.
Well, let me just tell you, I support the For the People Act and moving big money out of politics because I don't accept money from fossil fuel interests. I don't accept money from big pharma or from arms manufacturers. Just to be clear, where I come from on these things, I favor a small donor way of funding politics that comes from people in your district and keeps you honest and don't have to make all of those phone calls to special interest groups to fund your way or your seat in Congress. So that has been where I come from in politics. And what was your original question, Michael?
I just wanted to know how you were dealing with the moderate Democrats.
Look, I have a good relationship with many moderate members of Congress, and I have to tell you, I am quite pleased with Joe Biden's position and on some of the key issues that we're debating in Congress. The $3.5 trillion bill that would fund everything from daycare to Medicare for all and address climate change and usher in immigration. He has, defaulted to being bigger and bolder in his position than we ever hoped. Absolutely. That has moved a lot of the moderates and more conservative members of our caucus. And with respect to the developments of the past week plus, Joe Biden played an important role in getting them to vote for advancing the big package as well as the smaller transportation package that was passed out of the Senate, one that we're working on changing to ensure that it is greener, that it is bolder, and that it helps do away with all of the inequities that we have perpetuated, especially against people of color and the poor through some of our policies like the building of the interstate highway system across America that has split communities, that has brought in urban removal of communities of color, and that today is advancing very rapidly the forces of gentrification in cities. So that's how I deal with them and how I'm dealing with the White House as well in these negotiations.
So everything you just mentioned, that would mostly be considered part of the Build Back Better thing, right?
Yes.
What they're calling
yes.
Build Back Better. And the Green New Deal, how much traction is that building, or are we sliding backwards with Green New Deal?
With the transportation, the infrastructure bill that came out of the Senate is mostly, hard infrastructure, roads and bridges and things like that. Broadband, a very positive aspect of it. What it lacks, Katie, are the elements, the key elements of the Green New Deal that are essential for us to address climate change, to decarbonize, to move toward electric vehicles and charging stations all over the country. And many of the elements of this bill that was passed out of the Senate don't address gridlock. They don't address the induced demand that just building more highways and more capacity will do. It'll just crowd those roads within a year, usually when added capacity is brought to the fore. What we need is a significant investment in things like public transit for Chicago, for San Francisco, for New York, for southern states. High-speed rail is important. And of course, the decarbonization of our society. Those are the things that we continue to work for to incorporate into this bill in the reconciliation process. Many of the tenets of the Green New Deal are not in that, and that's what people like Chairman Pete DeFazio of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee are fighting for. We passed such a bill that moves us in that direction out of the House, the INVEST Act. That was the 5-year renewal of our transportation funding systems across the country. That's not what is in the Senate. That's what we're fighting to incorporate into the Senate in these coming days and weeks in Congress. That is what we need. I also want to say there is a significant investment in housing as infrastructure in the package that we helped move forward on Tuesday in Congress. That is key to address homelessness, to provide more multifamily housing for working families, and to make home ownership a reality for people who haven't had those opportunities.
Chuy, we just learned that the Supreme Court, the conservative 6-3 conservative Supreme Court, has nixed the moratorium on evictions. What are the ramifications of that, and what can be done?
Yeah. This is a real travesty on the part of the court. The president was responding to a reality that recognizes there are millions of people in jeopardy of becoming homeless, contributing to the spread of the COVID-19, the Delta variant. If they are forced out of their houses through evictions, they're simply doing Trump's work in my way of looking at this. The good thing for Illinois is that Governor Pritzker has extended the housing eviction moratorium in Illinois. I'm hoping that other governors will do the same. And of course, we'll continue to look for ways to protect people, prevent them from becoming evicted, from becoming homeless, and of course, further endangering themselves because of the spread of the Delta variant.
And finally, Congressman Garcia, as we all know, you made a strong run for mayor in 2015, forcing a runoff with the sitting mayor at the time. As you see the current mayor struggling with everything from cops to COVID and its many repercussions, is it still a job you or any truly trustworthy, thoughtful person would want, first of all? And would you ever run again, a la Harold Washington, coming home from Congress to a more powerful job of Chicago mayor?
Oh, man. Look, I am totally focused and working my tail off to pass the big items in the legislation that we have before us. If and when we do that, we will begin the transformation of our country and our society and assume a leadership role in fighting climate change. I don't care what other countries are doing. We have a leadership role. We have a moral responsibility to lead. So if we make life better for families, for children, for working moms to safely return to work, to finish off the pandemic, to build affordable housing for people, to expand Medicare so that people have the basic coverage that they need and make more people eligible for Medicare earlier. Those are huge things that we will do in Congress. Then I will be in a much more reflective mood about the future of what needs to happen. But I tell you what, if we pass this legislation, it will provide resources to make Chicagoland, Chicago and our suburban sisters and brother communities much better places. It will usher in the beginnings of new equity for people and help us dismantle the historic inequities that our society has thrown upon people and limited them. So a whole lot is on the line. The future of democracy is on the line. In order to restore democracy and for democracy to flourish, we need to pass this big, bold legislation for our people, for all of our people.
And that will be it. We want to thank you so much, Representative Garcia, for coming on this morning, for making time, and also for your ongoing commitment to the people of your district and beyond. We really appreciate your work.
Keep running.
Thank you so much.
It's always good to see you.
Great to speak and to see you, and hope to see you very soon.
We will.
Amen.
Thank you.
Brother.
Peace.
Peace.
These jokers can't even keep the lights on, or the heat on, or the water running when the temperature drops in Texas. Now they want to take over our elections? Are you going to let them? No, me neither. They're trying to stop more people from voting in a state that is already the toughest in America in which to vote. And what happens? Look, it's not an abstract thing. What happens when you can't vote? You have no say over the quality of your kid's school. You have no say over who represents you on the city council. You have no say about affordable housing in your community. You have no say about justice, especially racial justice in this country. I would ask you to call your senator. But between inciting insurrection and taking off to the Ritz-Carlton in Cancun when the temperature drops, he's got his plate full. So this is what I want you to do. We've got a president in the White House who cares about us, every one of us, Republican, Democrat, Independent, wants to make sure that the voting rights in this country are respected. He needs to hear from you. And we tell him, Mr. President, we're doing our part. And we have lots of hope. But right now, we need some help. You need to use all of the political capital you have to push through the For the People Act. It is the 1965 Voting Rights Act of our day. I need you to call him.
Well, that was, Katie, are you going to tell about that video we just saw?
Well, it was a YouTube video that featured Beto speaking, and I'm not going to say anything about it because I didn't just watch it.
Well, we're gonna address a lot of voter suppression, but I wanted to start off initially, Beto. We wanted to talk about the border before the rash of voter suppression laws swept the country. So what we wanted to hear from you a little bit about what's going on in the border. What are the routes? Has it improved? Any solutions that you see on the horizon?
Well, as you both know very well, there are a lot of people fleeing some significant misery, especially in the Northern Triangle countries of Central America, traveling more than 2,000 miles to seek refuge and asylum and safety here in our country. The previous administration made it extraordinarily hard for them to do it. And in fact, many, myself included, would argue broke US law in keeping them from legitimate asylum application requests. And really, they were in these detention camps in cities like Ciudad Juarez and Tijuana and other Mexican border communities. That situation in the first few months of the Biden administration has improved significantly. The Biden administration is trying to ensure that we follow US law when it comes to a side job at reducing the number of days and even hours that children and families are kept in Border Patrol detention. And as you know, they're beginning to reunite the thousands of families that were separated under President Trump's cruel zero tolerance family separation policy. So we see some positive steps in the right direction. It is not fast enough and it's not big enough in terms of the change that we need to see to US policy. So we want to encourage the Biden administration to do more, reunite more of these families, do a better job of following our asylum laws. And then, as you just suggested, Michael, get to the underlying causes that would force someone to flee this great distance. You know, the violence, the level of poverty, the effects of climate change, and the US-sponsored civil wars and drug wars that have really ravaged and hollowed out so much of Latin America, especially Central America. These are the things that we've got.
There's a lot of talk in the news about jobs going unfilled, and someone in El Paso told me that there are signs everywhere along Mesa, et cetera, of people looking for people to fill positions. And could their case be made in Congress to increase work visas, to let more people in, to train, to fill these jobs like many generations of earlier migrants have done?
You know, the first step that I'd love to see, Michael, is that we ask businesses to pay a higher wage.
Right on.
The minimum in El Paso is $7.25 an hour, which means that you probably got to work 2, and in some cases, depending on how big your family is, 3 jobs at a minimum wage in order to make ends meet. So that's certainly not a situation that's working for the people of El Paso or Texas or throughout most of the country. But to the spirit of your question, yes, we saw the lowest population growth in the United States over a 10-year period since 1790. We are in desperate need of more talent, more people, and those who can come to this country and make us better by their very presence. So I hope part of what President Biden does is really push a comprehensive immigration bill through Congress. That is a priority for this country.
So that's great to know, and we couldn't agree more about the need for a more comprehensive immigration improvement
and higher wages.
Reform, and of course the higher wages. Both Michael and I have been to those areas and seen what the U.S. government was doing in the 80s in Nicaragua, Honduras, and Guatemala. And so we're right there with you. The next thing that we see, and we're very, very concerned about, is voting rights and fighting voter suppression. The big lie is still being given as the excuse for suppressive voting laws. What just happened this week in Texas? Did they pass something horrendous that we heard about?
They did last Friday in the dead of night, literally at 3 a.m. in the morning. They passed a set of voter suppression provisions that would make it much harder for people to vote in Texas. And Katie, this is already the toughest state in the nation in which to register to vote and in which to cast a ballot. It's 50th out of 50 in ease of voting. And those voter suppression tactics historically have been targeted at Black voters, at Mexican-American voters, voters with disabilities, young voters, old voters, and voters in big cities. And it's no surprise that these current voter suppression bills target these same set of voters. It does away with 24-hour voting, which is really hard on shift workers. Again, you're working two $7.25 an hour jobs. That second shift may get off at 2 a.m. Your next shift may start at 8 a.m. If you don't have 24-hour voting, you're not voting at all. It does away with curbside voting, which would be very hard for those with disabilities. It requires those with disabilities to disclose what their disability is in a public setting. So personal, private, privileged information being released to the public. And then perhaps one of the most pernicious elements of this, it allows so-called poll watchers who historically have been posted at polls to keep Black voters and lower income voters from freely being able to vote. It allows them free reign in the polling places, including allowing them to videotape voters as they try to cast their ballots. We know that is likely to dissuade really an untold number of voters and voters targeted within certain demographics that Republicans and frankly, the white men in power in Texas fear the most. So the answer to this is to ensure that we mobilize in Texas to stop these before final passage and before they're signed into law by our Governor Greg Abbott. And then maybe just as importantly, to appeal to our US senators and to the president to pass the For the People Act, which would roll back these voter suppression efforts in states like Georgia and Texas and Florida and expand voting rights throughout the country. That's the way that we meet this challenge with action.
So I'm going to follow up on that just one thing, because different parts of the country have different orientations. For example, you just mentioned poll watchers. The way that we beat the daily machine in Chicago was poll watching. We were the first ones that went into polling places and turned to the back of the machine with the judges and said, I want to see that no votes have been cast, So that was our defense. So what you're describing is a situation where the Republicans, who clearly don't want anybody to vote because they can't win, that seems to be what's going on. They are the ones recruiting poll watchers. Why do we not have poll watchers on both sides is one question.
It's really interesting that you bring up the difference between how poll watching has been conducted in Illinois and then how poll watching has been conducted in Kansas. I mean, in Texas and frankly in Kansas and in other states that are facing voter suppression measures. In Texas, this sordid history of poll watching goes all the way back to the Ku Klux Klan, who would post their members at various polling locations. It's connected to the poll tax and the enforcement of the literacy test around voting, all provisions intended to keep Black voters from participating in our politics What you see in Texas today with this very onerous voter ID system, a number of, in fact, 750 polling place closures over the last 8 years, and a racial gerrymander of our state, not my words, but the words of a 3-judge federal panel, is you see Jim Crow dressed up in 21st century clothing. And this idea that we are simply standardizing elections in Texas and that all of these provisions apply equally to Black and white voters alike, when we know the outcome and the effect is certainly targeted at Black voters and other voters of color. What makes it so hard, Katie, is that the 1965 Voting Rights Act was gutted in the 2013 Supreme Court Shelby decision. So there's no pre-clearance provision. So the Department of Justice can't review all these awful things that Texas and Georgia and Florida and other southern and western states are doing, in Arizona. And it's really, if we don't pass the For the People Act, it'll take us years under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act to bring these issues to court and adjudicate them successfully. We need action now.
So one of the things that we've been saying on this show in regards to that, because we also cover historic stuff, is that we need an anti-war size movement really across the country, banging on voters' rights and pushing to pass the bill that's making its way through Congress right now.
For the people.
Yeah. When you started something called Powered by People, is that the right name I've got?
That's right.
And so we're talking community organizing, aren't we?
Absolutely. Our volunteers are going door to door to register voters in Texas. So even if these bills pass and become law, these voter suppression bills, we can still win. It's just going to be a lot harder, and we have to start working a lot earlier. And we can't do it at a distance. We can't literally phone it in. We've got to be at people's doors, having conversations now in 2021. If we have any hope of winning in 2022 or 2024. So Powered by People is comprised of literally tens of thousands of volunteers, primarily in Texas, but we also have them in Illinois and Chicago and really everywhere else in this country, all of whom are focused on restoring and strengthening our democracy and ensuring that in states like Texas, there's a level enough playing field so that Democrats can compete and win statewide elections. And so I'm really proud of the voter registration work our volunteers have done, but they've also done a lot of humanitarian work after we had a really bad winter storm and power outage where nearly 200 Texans died, many of hypothermia and carbon monoxide inhalation. Our volunteers were on the phones and on the doors, bringing water and food and transportation and connecting people to warming centers so that they could literally survive. And we've done something very similar around COVID vaccines in the poorest, hardest hit zip codes in the state, knocking on doors, signing people up for a vaccine, making sure that in a state that's lost 50,000 people already, that we don't lose any more needlessly. And so a lot of great community-based organizing in Texas right now.
You know, let me follow that up, Beto. I've been coming down there for basketball in the barrio for about 20-something years. And there was always talk about Texas turning blue from people I met. And I know there were a lot of hopes for this recent election. And I'm sure that some gains were made, but we had no significant victories. And one of the talking points that came out of it was how in the Valley, the Latino vote did not go for the Democrats as much as was expected. And it occurred to, while Katie and I were talking, that a lot of, there's a conservative strain in the Latino community and always been a number of kind of Republicans. What do we do going forward? Do we try to change those people's minds, or do we get more results? Does a larger opportunity exist if we register new voters and do a lot more, basic organizing to turn out the vote on all sectors?
Overall, Latinos overwhelmingly favored Biden-Harris in 2020 throughout the country, including in Texas. But I think the way that you phrased the question is accurate. They did not vote for Biden at the levels that many expected them to. And I think what we're coming to realize as we pore over the voter data from 2020 is that it wasn't so much that Latino voters in El Paso and Laredo and McAllen and Brownsville switched their votes from 2016 to 2020, from Democrats to Republicans, but that new Latino voters who had not voted in 2016 were compelled to come out for perhaps the first time in their lives. And I think there were a number of extraordinary circumstances, including the deadliest pandemic of our lifetimes, the worst recession since the Great Depression, and a host of other unique challenges, especially along the border, that might have precipitated that outcome and that turnout that we saw. You also had this, Michael. Democrats were not on the ground knocking on doors and meeting voters where they were. Republicans were. Republicans did do that hard work. And we can debate whether that was the appropriate thing to do given the public health guidance at the time prior to the vaccine. But nonetheless, when we take our entire army off the field, it shouldn't surprise us when the other army does better than they did the last time around. So I think lesson for all of us, and myself included, is we cannot ever cede the field, and we've got to contest every single door. And so I have been traveling to border communities like Laredo, which is about a 10-hour drive from my home in El Paso, to go knock on doors and meet voters and listen to them and understand what's most important to them. And they need to be hearing a really compelling, simple economic message around wages. You know, we keep coming back to $7.25 an hour. That just doesn't work for anyone. Or healthcare. We're the least insured state in the country. That region, the Mexican border counties in Texas, the Texas counties that border Mexico, are the least insured within the least insured state, which means, Michael and Katie, that people routinely die of diabetes. They die of the flu. They die of curable cancers. And of course, they've been dying from COVID at record rates. So talking about just making sure that you can see a doctor and fill a prescription and take your child to a therapist, making sure that you don't have to work 2 or 3 jobs to make ends meet. These are the kinds of things that we need to be saying at people's doors, but we can't put it on TV or on a billboard or put it in the mail or say it on Facebook and hope that people are watching. We've got to show up and pay the respect due to those who will decide the outcome of the next election. Speaking
of the next election, you've now had experience in 2 big elections where we all got to know you better. When you ran in Texas, and because you are who you are and the race was what it was, a lot of us got to know you and in fact supported you from very far away. You ran for president. What did you learn running for president about who's in charge, who gets covered? Why do Dems fight one another in ridiculous ways? I have stories from 2016 when I was a Bernie delegate, and then I came home and worked for Hillary. And I'm telling you, I could tell you things about that presidential campaign that made it obvious why we didn't win. So any reaction to electoral politics? A lot of us, work in it as volunteers. We feel we are the Democratic Party's foot soldiers, but we also get frustrated by what. Yeah. So
I think I share a lot of your frustration, and I think a lot of people do, and not just Democrats, but Americans. The role that, for example, Iowa plays in selecting our nominee, an overwhelmingly white state with a lot of great people in it, but not necessarily most representative of who our country is. I mean, come to Texas, come to Houston, for example, which is the most diverse city in America, bar none. You'll find the largest Vietnamese language speaking population outside of Vietnam in Houston. They speak 120 different languages in the school system in Houston. As Michael knows from his visits to El Paso, the city I'm in is 85% Mexican American. It's a beautiful blending of 2 cultures and 2 nationalities and 2 languages. You're not going to see a whole hell of a lot of that in Iowa or in New Hampshire. So having a process by which we allow the extraordinarily diverse electorate of the Democratic Party and the extraordinary diverse population of the United States to determine who should represent us as our candidate across this country. I think that would be extraordinarily helpful, and to make it a true contest of ideas and vision and platforms and policies, as well as personality. You're never going to get away from personality. I think that could really improve the process. But I'll tell you this, I have been so pleasantly surprised by President Biden's performance so far. I mean, I don't know that I would have been in the primary, race for president if I thought Biden was going to be as great a president as he has been. I would have sat back and gotten behind him, or gotten behind Bernie, or gotten behind somebody else. But I think he surprised so many of us with how steadfastly progressive he has been, how he's really turned the attention away from himself and the presidency, where Donald Trump had it, and really focused on the rest of the country, and has brought much needed relief and aid to those who are really, really struggling. And so I am cautiously optimistic about what he will do next when it comes to climate and infrastructure, democracy, immigration. I like what he did on the minimum wage for federal contractors, and I hope he uses all the muscle he's got to raise that wage for everyone else working throughout this country. So I certainly see room for a tremendous amount of improvement in how we select our nominee, but I am really grateful for how our nominee performed in the general election and what he's done thus far as president.
So besides running this Powered by People, I hear you're teaching in college. What else do you do to keep yourself busy?
I'm so lucky. I'm teaching a class at Texas State, an undergraduate course on Texas politics. And then I'm teaching a graduate course at the University of Texas LBJ School that's on voting rights and the history of voting rights in America, which is a fascinating story, and the history of voting rights in Texas, which is also fascinating and terribly sad and uplifting alternately, depending on what year or decade you're looking at. But it's interesting that, having spent the semester focused on that, that's effectively the most important, or essentially the most important issue developing in this country right now. What passed in Florida, what passed in Georgia, what recently passed and could be signed into law in Texas, and what is pending in 44 other state legislatures right now, on top of the insurrection on the 6th of January, the big lie that you mentioned at the top of the show. I mean, if you care about democracy, this is the most essential time for you to be alive and in the fight. So I learned a lot in that class from my students. I hope I was able to share a lot, and now we're all working on this stuff in real day-to-day life.
Maybe you could whip up a quick book on voter rights that could go countrywide and help us do what we need to do in the next year and a half before the midterms even.
I'd love to be able to do that.
Speaking of voter rights, I saw you on the Nicole Wallace show the other day, and you definitely dodged questions about your future, saying that wherever you're needed most, either on the ground or in running for office. But you did stress the importance that the biggest priority is voting rights and the fear of losing democracy. And you really called on people to put pressure on the president and other elected officials. Do you want to expand upon that a little bit?
Absolutely. So, a lot of people are referring to this moment as Jim Crow 2.0, and one might be forgiven for asking, well, what the hell does that mean? And what was Jim Crow 1.0? And we know that from the end of Reconstruction, so the last flourishing of multiracial democracy, until 1965, African Americans in the South and frankly through much of the country were denied full citizenship, full civil rights, and the ability to participate in our democracy. And it took John Lewis and Fannie Lou Hamer and Rosa Parks and so many civil rights heroes, many of whom gave their lives as martyrs to the cause, to compel this country by forcing our conscience to do the right thing. And that resulted in the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. There is no way that Lyndon Baines Johnson would have used his limited political capital in the first years of his presidency to push through these controversial bills if he was not forced to do so by those who took action and applied the pressure that produced the political will to get the job done at the end of the day. That's what we need right now, because we have a similar attack on multiracial democracy, rolling back the hard-fought wins and gains secured in the 65 Voting Rights Act. And Shelby did it, the voter suppression measures, the insurrection, the big lie. I mean, this is it. And so all of us must step up right now and speak out and compel the president, who I think is a good man and believes in this issue and wants to do the right thing. But I think in some instances, we've got to force the president to do that. And I heard an apocryphal story about FDR meeting with the NAACP, who outlined a litany of complaints about how African Americans were treated in this country. And according to this apocryphal story, FDR said to the NAACP representatives, "I know you're right. Now make me do something about pressure and public sentiment to bear, so that I have no other choice but to do the right thing." I think we're in that kind of a moment with President Biden. He knows we're right. Now we've got to make him do it. And so that one is on all of us. We can't just blame our members of Congress or castigate the Republican Party. We have to look at ourselves and decide what we are willing to do.
Boy, you said it best. And one thing reminding people on this show is that the 50 senators who caucus with the Democrats represent about 41.5 million more Americans than the 50 Republican senators represent. And if we could get that straightened out before the next presidential, we might have a chance of, a different outcome of
Amen.
The Electoral College.
Well, we want to thank you. And if you ever do run for office, we'll help you out any way we can, or whatever you're doing. You're a hell of a guy. And I look forward to seeing El Paso and watching you in the news.
Thank
Let
you
me know
so
when you're in
much.
town.
Thank you so much for your service, Beto. Keep on, keep strong.
Power to the
Thank
people.
you, both of you as well. Adios.
Okay, that's it for this week, kids. Hope you enjoyed. And what do you got to say, Kate?
Well, we'll be back live next week. Thanks for listening to the segments that we chose for you on our week off.
It's our Labor Day show, too.
Yeah, it's Labor Day. And basically, we want to remember and mark how flippin' lucky we are, where we are and how we are, given the rest of the world's situation, which we take very seriously and talk about week after week. Let's just be grateful right now. Let's stick together and have some fun. Jump in the lake.
Until next week, do good in the world.
The world needs all the good we do.
All power to the people.